G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Daniel. Now, this is a study that has been prepared by Dr. Alan Fruchtenbaum of RL Ministries, the founder. Thank you for coming along. So we're into session 8 of the Book of Daniel. We're going to look at chapter 5, verse 1 to 21 today. Now, chapter 4 ended with the return of Nebuchadnezzar after 7 years of eating grass and living like an animal. He thought he was an ox. So after 7 years of looking on the ground, where his eyes were constantly focused on the ground, he suddenly lifted up his eyes skyward, and that was the turning point in his understanding. Suddenly, his understanding returned in full force, and now he understands the nature of the God of Israel. And his kingdom and throne were returned to him, and at the same time as his understanding returned, his insanity left him. And at that point, as he acknowledged that God Most High is indeed the only God, the prophecy concerning the tree, which remember was the tree banded with iron and brass, is also fulfilled. It's come to an end. His vision has now been fulfilled. Nebuchadnezzar was then restored to his throne. He received all his glory back, and the majesty of his kingdom was now returned to him. Now, we're going to look at the feast of Belshazzar and the fall of Babylon. We're just going to look at the feast of Belshazzar today in this session. Now, Daniel 5 describes the feast of Belshazzar and the fall of Babylon. Now, this chapter, together with chapter 6, forms a conclusion of the historical section of the book of Daniel. And then from chapter 7, we get into the prophetic section. So the first 4 verses of Daniel 5 describe the feast itself. Now, in order to understand some of the historical background to this chapter, we need to know that between chapters 4 and 5, a number of years had passed and a number of kings have begun to reign. We're just going to run through the list of Babylonian kings so we can see where we are when we come to discuss Belshazzar. First king of Babylon was Nabopolassar. That was Nebuchadnezzar's son. He reigned from 626 to, it wasn't his son, it was his father. He reigned from 626 to 605 BC, followed by his son Nebuchadnezzar from 605 to 562 BC. So Nebuchadnezzar encapsulated all the deportations from Israel. Nebuchadnezzar, as we shall see, was one of the longest reigning monarchs of the Babylonian Empire, and he's also of importance in Daniel. And then we had Amel-Marduk from 562 until 560 BC. You also find his name in the Bible as Evil-Merodach. He was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He reigned for only 2 years because he was murdered by his brother-in-law, who then took the throne after him. Now, Evil-Merodach is mentioned in 2 places in the Old Testament, 2 Kings 25, 27 to 30, and Jeremiah 52, 31 to 34. Now, he was replaced by his brother-in-law who had murdered him. And so this was Neriglissar from 560 on to 556 BC, also known as Nergal-Sharezer, which is the way his name appears in Jeremiah 39, 3 and 13. Now, he was not only Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, but also what is known as a Rab Mag, which means he was a high-ranking official of the king. Now, he took part in the siege and conquest of Jerusalem. And Neriglissar was succeeded by his son Labashi-Marduk from 556 BC. Now, his reign was very short. It was only 2 months. That was during May and June in 556 BC. Now, he was a son of Neriglissar, which would make him the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He was assassinated after reigning just 2 months by Nabonidus. Now, in the context of Daniel 5, Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar are the most prominent Babylonian rulers. Now, Nabonidus was married to King Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, Nitocris, that one, who is mentioned in Daniel 5. It's on the screen. He reigned from 556 to 539 BC. Now, for unknown reasons, he left Babylon in 552 BC and resided in Arabia until 543, 542 BC. Now, these were the parents of Belshazzar, that is Nabonidus and Nitocris. Then we had Belshazzar. Now, Belshazzar, he is from 553 until 539 BC. He's the key man in chapter 5. He was the son of Nabonidus, and he served as co-regent with his father. Nabonidus ruled by himself from 556 until 539. Now, having been put in this position 3 years later in 553 BC, Belshazzar continued with his father until the end of the Babylonian Empire in 539 BC. Now, being the son of Nabonidus and Nebuchadnezzar's daughter Nitocris made him the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Yes, we need to understand, it's important to understand here that since he was a co-regent, he was not the top man in the government, but the second top man. Yet he'll end up being the last ruler of the city of Babylon in fulfillment of a prophecy of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 27:6-7, he clearly prophesied Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom would continue through his sons and grandsons' reign. Now, Belshazzar is his grandson. It was going to end with his grandson. And now, because Belshazzar was the city's de facto king, he's considered the last ruler of Babylon. And this fulfills a prophecy found in Jeremiah 27:6-7. And I'll just read it for you. And now have I given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. And the beasts of the field also have I given him to serve him. And all the nations shall serve him, and his son's son, until the time of his own land come. And then many nations and great kings shall make him their bondman. Jeremiah prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar's lineage would end with his grandson, and Belshazzar was that grandson. Again, God's prophecies are right back onto the very last detail. Now, back to Daniel 5. The background to the co-regency and the festival itself lies in the fact that Nabonidus, the father of Belshazzar, had another capital which he preferred to Babylon. When Nabonidus became king, he stayed in Babylon for only 3 years. He really didn't like it there. He preferred another royal residence which he built in the town of Tamar, which was in Arabia, and his preference for Tamar above Babylon did create some animosity among the Babylonians. In fact, at one time he stayed there for 14 years straight without once visiting the city of Babylon. And since he preferred to live in Tamar and Babylon remained the capital, to maintain a royal presence in Babylon, he made his son Belshazzar co-regent, giving him full regal powers over the city of Babylon, beginning in the year 553 BC. Name Belshazzar means Bel, protect the king, which is very close to Daniel's Babylonian name. Bel, remember, was one of the key Babylonian deities, along with Merodach or Marduk, and Belshazzar, this is the co-regent, was named after this Babylonian god Bel. This feast takes place in 539 BC between chapters 4 and 5 of Daniel. And between chapters 4 and 5 of Daniel, 23 years have now transpired. Now, remember what we said when we started, that the book of Daniel was not written in chronological sequence. So chapter 7 took place 14 years earlier than this feast in 553 BC, and chapter 8 took place 11 years earlier in 551 BC. So Daniel is not writing history as such. That's not his purpose, although he certainly has certain historical truths to tell us. Because he's not writing history, he does not put his book in chronological sequence. Rather, he is developing his theme, and we know in the beginning of the study was the theme of Daniel is the times of the Gentiles. And so he selects his material in a way that best portrays that theme that he's developing. There's also a sub-theme about what will happen to Israel during the period of Gentile dominance. So by the time of the feast, Daniel had been in Babylon for at least 66 years. So by the time chapter 5 comes into being, which is in 539 BC, Daniel has already received some more detailed information concerning the times of the Gentiles and the transference of power from Babylon to Medo-Persia. Therefore, the events of chapter 5 would not have taken him by surprise. By this time, he already knows all about chapters 7 and 8. In the year 539 BC, when this feast takes place, the Persians had already begun invading Babylon. Now, various provinces of the Babylonian Empire had already revolted against the central government and declared their independence. And a short time previously, Nabonidus had returned to Babylon in order to prepare his defenses against the Persians. And before this feast took place, he left the city in order to fight against Cyrus and the Persian army. Cyrus had already begun his conquest and had captured a great deal of territory. And in the battle that followed, Nabonidus lost out, and he was captured and was made to spend the rest of his life in exile outside the territory of Babylonia and his favorite city of Tamar. He was now a prisoner of Cyrus, while the rest of the country had fallen to the Persians. By this time, only the city of Babylon was still intact, and the Persians were now outside the city walls, besieging the city itself. And it was at this time, when they're being besieged, and in these conditions, that Belshazzar decided to make a great feast to 1,000 of his lords. So the hosting of great banquets was something which was typical of Oriental kings, especially of Persian kings. And you can have a look in the first chapter of the book of Esther, for instance. The Persian kings would dine in company with up to 15,000 at their banquet. Now, it would seem a bit of a foolhardy thing to do in light of the fact that his city is now being besieged by the Medes and the Persians. So why would he throw such a feast for his leaders and the upper class of his society at the time when his city was being besieged? Well, if you want to put on a big show, this is what you do. It seems he was trying to simply build up faith in the Babylonian gods and also in the city's defenses. He took the fatal step also of even removing his watchmen from off the walls to participate in the feast. So on this particular night, no one was actually watching to see what was happening outside. Now, he might well put his trust in the fortifications of Babylon, because remember, the walls were massive. There were massive walls around the city. In fact, there were 2 walls around the city with a moat in between. They're very high walls, very thick walls. So it would take a lot of chiseling away to dig your way through the walls. Now, looking at Belshazzar himself, he was once a favorite target for Scripture's critics. Why? Because chapter 6 talks about Daniel in the lion's den, when in the last century he was in the critics' den, because there is absolutely no record of the existence of such a man, Belshazzar, in history. Whenever someone mentioned Belshazzar, the critics would smirk and say, as one of them did, that there was no such animal known as Belshazzar. But once again, the archaeologist Spade had silenced these critics, because we now have several documents which substantiate the existence of Belshazzar, who was a son of Nabonidus. Toward the end of the 1800s, until the turn of the century, when archaeologists actually began digging deeper, they found a bunch of records with Belshazzar's name on them. Originally, the critics denied his existence until these cuneiform tablets were found with his name on them, proving his existence. Now, they had tried a new and different tactic. They can no longer say that he didn't exist because the evidence is in place. Their new attack lies in the fact that in all these records outside the Bible, Belshazzar is never called king, but Daniel calls him king, and so they attack Daniel for it. Their point is that Belshazzar could not have functioned in the role of king while his father, Nabonidus, was still living. And Nabonidus lived for the entire duration of the remaining years of the Babylonian Empire. Therefore, what the critics claim is that Belshazzar would never have had the right to function as king. So we're going to take a look at the facts as they stand and compare them with what these other ancient records say. First important fact is that Daniel does call Belshazzar the king in chapter 5, verse 1. And later on in verse 30, he calls him the king of the Chaldeans. And then in Daniel 7, verse 1, he'll also call him the king of Babylon. So clearly then, as far as Daniel was concerned, Belshazzar did have the title of king. A second biblical fact is that Daniel also speaks of the kingdom or the reign of Belshazzar in chapter 8, verse 1. So not only is he called king, but he also reigns. Therefore, he has a kingdom. Third fact lies in the dates which Daniel gives to events. He dates some of his material according to the reign of Belshazzar. In chapter 7, verse 1, such and such happened in the first year of Belshazzar, means he's the king. In 8:1, he mentions the third year of Belshazzar. So these are three facts that arise from the biblical text. Now, what about the outside records? Other facts emerge from these other records which the critics use to try to disprove the Bible. So a fourth fact is true. All the cuneiform tablets that have been dug up by the archaeologists speak of Belshazzar as the son of the king. The title king is never applied to Belshazzar as far as the present records show. Another fact is that these same cuneiform records do date events, both from the years of Nabonidus and Belshazzar. All the cuneiform tablets that we have from archaeology do just as Daniel did in his book. They date events according to a certain year in the reign of Nabonidus, the father of Belshazzar, but also from a certain year of Belshazzar. That part is true, but remember, we don't have all the records yet. And a lot of records have been destroyed. So perhaps, as they keep digging along, they might find some more records. Now, in a record written by Nabonidus himself, which is known to archaeology as the Persian verse account, PVA, Persian verse account, Nabonidus writes that he entrusted the kingship to his son Belshazzar. He doesn't call him king, so that part of the criticism is true. But he does say that he entrusted the kingship of Babylon to Belshazzar. And he goes on to say that he, Nabonidus, made his residence elsewhere outside of Babylon in the city of Tamar, which he preferred to live there. And he built it to look similar to Babylon. So while he lived in Tamar, this is Nabonidus, he appointed his son Belshazzar with full regal honors and rights in the city of Babylon. Another thing we note from these documents of the ancient world is that Belshazzar performed all of the important kingly functions in Babylon while Nabonidus was in Tamar. We're told that he was responsible for the upkeep of the temples in Babylon. That was the job of a king. We're also told that he made sure that the canals and waterways were kept clear. Again, that was the role of the king. We also learn that people who took an oath in Babylon did so in the names of both Nabonidus and Belshazzar. We know that decrees were issued in both names. Now, there was also some astrological reports from Babylon issued in both names. Whenever subjugated peoples delivered their tribute, they did this to both Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Belshazzar had all the subordinate officials that a king ordinarily has, and he did all the things that a king would normally do. Now, a record has also been found that contains a prayer that Nabonidus wrote, where he associates Belshazzar with himself in a unique way when discussing rule and reign. Finally, Belshazzar's legal power was seen in that these same records point out that he was the one who granted leases, issued commands, and maintained the royal administration. All of these were kingly functions. So although we do not have a specific title of Belshazzar the king in these records, yet it is acknowledged the fact that he was a real person with regal power, authority, and position. And as the critics used to make fun of Belshazzar's existence because no extant document carried his name, so now that there are these documents which prove his existence, these should keep today's critics also silent. We might yet find some more documents which say that he's a king. All the buried documents have not been unearthed yet. So it's quite possible that a document might be found which gives him that title. Whatever we do or not, there's already sufficient evidence to show that Belshazzar did indeed function in the role of a king. So there's no reason to say that Daniel was wrong in anything that he wrote so far. Now, the feast. We're looking at the feast. We're going to go from chapter 5, verses 1 to 4. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink therefrom. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. So now in verse 1, Belshazzar puts on a feast which includes drinking of wine before the 1,000. Now the drinking of wine as such is not forbidden in Scripture, but the problem here is that the drinking of wine in Babylon was also an act of worship of the Babylonian gods. Verse 4 tells us they raised their vessels in honor of their gods. So it was this that sets the stage now for what's about to happen next. And in verses 2 to 4, we have the desecration of the holy vessels. We first read about these vessels back in chapter 1, verse 2, when Nebuchadnezzar brought them out of the house of God in Jerusalem and put them in the temple of his own God. Now, decades later, Belshazzar, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, ordered these vessels of God to be taken out of the pagan temple and brought into the banqueting hall of his own God's temple. And in verse 2, it says that he did this while he tasted the wine. So the emphasis here is that he had already drunk too much, and he began to lose his better judgment, probably becoming a bit foolish with alcohol now causes him to undertake what he's about to do. Verse 2 goes on to say, vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was Jerusalem. So from the days of Nebuchadnezzar until the occasion of this feast, the temple treasures had been stored without sacrilegious use. Nebuchadnezzar had brought them to Babylon during the deportations of the Jews. It says here that Nebuchadnezzar was his father. Well, in actual fact, the Hebrew and Aramaic word father can also simply mean ancestor. And in this case, Nebuchadnezzar is his grandfather. Ancient Hebrew and Aramaic languages did not have separate words for grandfather, great-grandfather, and so on. It just says father. So the term father was applied to both an immediate father and also to a grandfather or great-grandfather. For instance, if we look into the book of Genesis, how often God speaks to Jacob and says, I'm the God of Abraham, your father. But we know that Abraham was Jacob's grandfather because Isaac was Jacob's actual father. Isaac was Jacob's father. So this verse 2 should not present anyone with a problem. Relationship between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar was that of a grandfather to a grandson. And the Hebrew and Aramaic term father covers this relationship because his mother, Nitocris, was the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 2, we also learn who else was included in this feast. So beside the king himself and his lords, there were his wives and his concubines. So not only was this a drunken orgy associated with the act of worshipping a Babylonian god, there was licentiousness going on as well, which was also incorporated into the worship of Babylonian gods. And in verse 3, we're told the vessels are now desecrated, as the king, his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. So they were drinking from the holy vessels in honor of the Babylonian gods. Now, there's no question of whether Belshazzar knew what he was doing. Clearly, the emphasis of the repetition in verses 2 and 3 is that the vessels had been used in the worship of the God of Israel, and the king of Babylon knew about their significance. And then verse 4 says, they praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass, of tin, wood and of stone. So they used the vessels which belonged to the one and only true God for their drinking. And in the course of their drunkenness, they praised the gods of Babylon. So he deliberately defied the Most High God, whom he had learned about from his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. The drinking of wine like this in Babylon was a means of idolatrous worship, and these holy vessels were being desecrated by being used in an improper way during the worship of foreign gods. Now, verses 5 to 6, we see now the writing on the wall. In the same hour came forth the fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against a candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed in him, and his thoughts troubled him, and the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Verses 5 to 6 show that a miracle occurred at a divinely chosen point. While the feast was going on, with its drinking and shouting of praises to Babylonian gods, fingers appeared and began writing on the wall of the palace. In verse 5, suddenly, writing appears on the wall. It happened when? It happened in the same hour. It's the same hour that the desecration of the vessels from the house of God took place. And at that very same moment, a hand came forth. To come forth here means in Aramaic to come out. So this hand was actually coming out of the wall. And this is what Belshazzar saw. He saw the fingers of a man's hand coming out of the wall. In the Aramaic, it literally reads, the fingers of the hand of the man. So this was not a vision. It was not an image or a shadow or a reflection. The fingers literally came out of the wall. And once they had appeared, they began to write on that part of the wall where the lampstand was. Why? Because it was written right where everyone could easily see it in the brightest of light. It was written upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Now, archaeologists have also dug up the actual banqueting hall of the Babylonian monarchs. And from them we know it was 170 feet long by 55 feet wide. Well, what's that? That's about, I don't know, it's about 50 meters by about 18 meters, something like that. The fact that the fingers began writing directly in front of a candlestick indicates that most, if not all, guests would have been able to see what was going on. Now, we also learned from archaeologists that the walls were covered with white plaster, which is exactly what Daniel says. Now, if Daniel did not really know about all this, how could he be so exact? So the hand writes against the white plaster on the wall, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now, the term, Aramaic term for part of the hand means the entire palm of the hand, from the wrist to the fingertips. So the whole hand was visible. And as he saw this sudden, strange phenomenon of a hand coming out of the wall first and then writing on the wall, it had certain effects upon Belshazzar, which were given in verse 6. First of all, it says, his countenance was changed in him. This means he went as white as a sheet. His countenance lost its brightness. Now, up to this point, his face was probably flushed with wine. But now he suddenly turned pale. Second, his thoughts troubled him. Third, the joints of his loins were loosed. Now, in the Bible, the loins are regarded as the seat of a man's strength. So his strength went from him completely. A man's loins are described as the source of his offspring in Genesis 35:11 and 46:26. Also 1 Kings 8:19 and 2 Chronicles 6:9. So it's Genesis 35:11, Genesis 46:26, 1 Kings 8:19, 2 Chronicles 6:9. Passages such as Deuteronomy 33:11 and Job 40:16 and Proverbs 31:17 describes the loins as a seat of strength. And in verse 3, Daniel mentioned that Belshazzar's wives and concubines were present at this banquet. Now, according to verse 4, they all drank wine from the holy vessels of the Jewish temple and raised them to their gods. Now, the sexual overtone of this description shouldn't be missed here. Keep in mind, his concubines were there, and these types of feasts frequently devolved into orgies. So Belshazzar may have been in a state of sexual arousal when the fingers came forth from the wall, and the statement that the joints of his loins were loose may refer to an immediate loss of any evidence of a sexual appetite. The fourth thing we're told here is that his knees smote one against the other. Well, the king collapsed, and of course, whenever something like this happens, you bring in the wise men. As always in the book of Daniel, in they come. But once again, they can't tell him anything. In verses 7 to 9, we see the failure of the wise men. The king cried aloud to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. King spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were perplexed. In verse 7, he issued the same kind of call his own grandfather had on 2 occasions in the past. The first was in chapter 2, the second was in chapter 4. The command included all the wise men. So the entire school of Babylonian astrology was to be brought in so that they could read this writing. This means that Belshazzar could not even read what it said on the wall, apparently. And they're commanded to be called in by Belshazzar for 2 reasons. First of all, to read this writing, and second, they are required to show me the interpretation. Now, Belshazzar is so afraid that he's willing to give the interpreter a great reward. And whoever succeeded in doing it, his reward would include 3 things. First, he'd be clothed with purple. To be clothed with purple was a symbol of high rank. And we have an example of this in Esther 8, verse 15. Second part of the reward was to have a gold chain about his neck. Now, this was a common gift of kings to those who found grace before them. And one example is the case of Joseph, which we see in Genesis 41, verse 42, where Pharaoh placed a gold chain around his neck. The third promise was to be third ruler of the kingdom. Now, this makes sense if we remember that Belshazzar was not the top man of the government. His father Nabonidus was the first man in the kingdom. Belshazzar was the second. So the highest position that Belshazzar could offer was the third position in the kingdom. Now, this third aspect of the promised reward had been another ground of criticism before it was realized that Belshazzar really was a king. After all, in our fairy tale stories, when the king makes such an offer, it is usually to the second top position, not the third. So why does Belshazzar only offer the third level of rulership? As we've clearly shown, by offering the third position rather than the second position, it's an authentication of the validity of Daniel's writing, because Belshazzar was not the sole regent, but a co-regent with his father, Nabonidus. So to be the third ruler was the highest position that Belshazzar could offer. Nabonidus was the first, Belshazzar was the second, and so the only offer he could make was to be the third. That's what he offers. In verse 8, his wise men failed. Now, this is the third such failure which we read of in the book of Daniel. They failed to interpret the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. They failed to interpret the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4. And now they also failed to read the writing in the wall. They couldn't read it, nor could they interpret it. Not very wise men, are they? And the result is now further trouble for the king. In verse 9, he was greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed still further. Nebuchadnezzar responded to the failure of his wise men with rage and a decree of mass execution. That's Nebuchadnezzar. We saw that back in Daniel chapter 2, verse 12. Here, Belshazzar's response was very weak. He was mortified, and he simply had nothing more to say. He was just frightened. As for his lords, 1,000 upper-class people who had been invited to this banquet, they were perplexed. The whole company was thrown into confusion. Eventually, all of this perplexity and confusion reaches a certain person, and so we next have the advice of the queen. Now, just as he was not present when Nebuchadnezzar had his dreams, Daniel was not present when the miraculous writing appeared at Belshazzar's banquet. Now the queen, this is verse 10 to 12. Now the queen by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. The queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance be changed. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And the king Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, I say your father, made him master of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of dark sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So here in the first part of verse 10, we have the entrance of the queen. This is not the queen in the sense of her being the wife of Belshazzar, because we saw back in verses 2 to 3, the wives of Belshazzar were already present at the banqueting table. This is the queen mother. She was the wife of Nabonidus, the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. She's the mother of Belshazzar. Nitocris, remember. When she hears of the perplexity and confusion which is stricken the banqueting hall, she comes in and gives her advice to her son. Her advice, we see, first of all in verse 10, not to fear or be troubled. She then provides a lengthy evaluation of Daniel in verses 11 to 12, which tells us that she knew certain things about his reputation and also what had happened to him since we last met him back in chapter 4, some 23 or 24 years earlier. She says that Daniel has the spirit of the holy gods. Again, the word gods in the plural, which means she, like her father, has put her evaluation in pagan format. So obviously, because she knew so well who Daniel was, she saw him as a messenger of the Babylonian gods and not as a messenger of the one true God. She goes on to say in verse 11 that Daniel had proved himself in the days of Nebuchadnezzar to have within him light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods. Again, she writes in pagan terms here, or she speaks in pagan terms. She reminds Belshazzar in this verse that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had appointed Daniel head over all the wise men. As the head of the Babylonian school of astrology, he was master of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. These were all representatives of different branches of the school of astrology. The very fact that Belshazzar is not aware of Daniel and his importance to the empire tells us that by this time, in the year 539 BC, Daniel was no longer holding that position as head of the Babylonian school of astrology. Somewhere in all the various government upheavals in the last 23, 24 years, and assassinations of kings and usurping of their thrones, which took place between the death of Nebuchadnezzar and the reign of Nabonidus and Belshazzar, Daniel had been deposed. We'll see later on that he did have some rights or some jobs to do within the government in another chapter. But his was no longer the top job. He was no longer the chief satrap of the province of Babylon, nor was he still the head of the school of Babylonian astrology. And for that reason, Belshazzar did not know who he was. Somewhere along the line, he had been demoted from prominence. And in verse 12, the queen spells out Daniel's unique abilities further, and she says 6 things about him. First of all, he has an excellent spirit. Second, he has knowledge. Third, he has understanding. Fourth, he knows how to interpret dreams. And fifth, he knows how to show or explain dark sentences. The phrase dark sentences means to untie knots or to solve riddles. So Daniel was one who could solve all kinds of riddles. And 6, as a result, he was able to dissolve doubts. He knew how to untie knots, not literal knots, of course, but problems. He knew how to think through problems and so on, and included the solving of riddles. At the end of verse 12, her advice comes to the point. Now let Daniel be called. So she said, let him be called into this banqueting hall, and he will show the interpretation. He'll tell you what this writing means. Now Belshazzar follows her advice, and in the next section, we come to the appeal he made to Daniel. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. The king spake and said unto Daniel, Are you that Daniel, who are of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Judah? I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Verse 15. And now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. But I have heard of you that you can give interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, you shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold about your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So as Daniel is brought in verse 13, we have, first of all, a clear identification who he is. Belshazzar asked Daniel, are you that same Daniel? Are you that same Daniel, the Jew we've heard about earlier? So once again, we can see here from the way Belshazzar phrases this question that he does not know Daniel. And this indicates that Daniel no longer had that same high position as in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. But verse 14 indicates that he does know of Daniel's reputation because of what the Queen Mother had just said to him. So he says, I've heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you. So he heard about Daniel's qualities of light and understanding and excellent wisdom. In verse 15, Belshazzar admits that his wise men have failed again. They've been brought in to show the interpretation, but they could not even understand the writing. So now the king makes his appeal to Daniel in verse 16. But I've heard of you that you can give interpretation, that you can dissolve doubts. So if he's able to read the writing and give the interpretation, then those three rewards which were promised earlier would now be given to him. He should be clothed with purple, gold chain, and you'd be the third ruler. Now, verses 17 to 28, Daniel now gives his response. And he gives a pretty lengthy response. We're going to see it in two sections, 17 to 24 and then 24 to 28. And he brings about a condemnation of Belshazzar. In verse 17, he makes a very simple declaration. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be to yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing unto the king, and make known unto him the interpretation. So in verse 17, Daniel rejects the gifts and rewards. Now notice here that Daniel did not even address the king with the same reverence as Nebuchadnezzar did back in chapter 3, verse 9, or Darius in chapter 6, verse 21. In fact, the Queen Mother also said, O king, live forever. But not Daniel. He just answered before the king. He cares nothing for the three promises which Belshazzar has made. Belshazzar does not have the regality of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. However, a refusal of the gifts does not mean that Daniel will refuse to read and interpret the writing. He's going to do it anyway. He'll still read and interpret what was written on the wall, but not for the sake of rewards. But before he proceeds to do that, he has a few things to teach Belshazzar. And in verses 18 to 21, Daniel now gives Belshazzar a history lesson from which he should have learned, but he failed to do so. O you king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father the kingdom, and greatness, and glory, and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all the peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he slew, and whom he kept alive, and whom he raised up, and whom he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. He was fed with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God ruleth in the kingdom of men, and that he setteth up over it whomsoever he will. So in these verses, the lesson of history which Daniel gives the king concerns his grandfather, who had become the great monarch of Babylon in the past. And in verse 18 and 19, this happened by the will of the Most High God, who was the possessor, or who is the possessor of heaven and earth, who gives what part of the world to whomsoever he will, and he gave it all to Nebuchadnezzar for that period of time. In verse 18, Nebuchadnezzar was given by divine appointment the kingdom and greatness and glory and majesty. Now, according to Genesis 14, when God is referred to as the Most High, it always refers to him as the possessor of the heavens and the earth. As the possessor, he can subdivide this earth as he wills and give portions of it to whomever he chooses to give it to. And for a while, he chose to give the earth over to Nebuchadnezzar, resulting in his having absolute control. As Daniel had pointed out earlier, the head of gold was symbolic of Nebuchadnezzar himself. In verses 18 to 21, Daniel now gives Belshazzar, I did that before. In verse 19, as a result of his autocratic rule, all trembled and feared before him. This is Nebuchadnezzar. All peoples, nations, and languages. The monarch had absolute control over life and death. And second, he carried out his rule with absolute authority and would not have a bar of questioning. Whom he would, he slew. Whom he would, he kept alive. He was top. He was a law unto himself, he was. Whom he would, he raised up. Whom he would, he also put down. He was absolute in his kingdom authority. And who would have thought anyone could bring him down? But the authority to kill or spare and to exalt or humble are typically ascribed to God, as established in the earlier chapters of Daniel, back in Daniel 2, verse 21, and Daniel 4, 17, 32, and 37. Daniel 2, 21, 4, 17, 4, 32, 4, 37. But God was the one who brought him down. The same one who built him up brought him down in verses 20 to 21. There came a point when Nebuchadnezzar was debased. The reason for it was his pride. In verse 20, Daniel simply reviews what happened to Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 4. And at one point, Nebuchadnezzar's heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened. So God removed him from his kingly throne in judgment, and for 7 years took his glory from him. And then in verse 21, we have the summary of the 4th chapter of the book of Daniel, where Nebuchadnezzar goes through a period of insanity. First of all, he was driven from the sons of men, so he is placed outside of human society. Second, during this time, his heart was made like a beast. And remember, he thought he was an ox. And third, we have one added point of information from Daniel here, which was that his dwelling was with the wild asses. Now, in the ancient world, wild asses were like the wild horses of brumbies in the outback of the high country. As there are bands of horses roaming about here and there, so in the Middle East, there are bands of asses roaming about. Although he thought he was an ox, this shows that Nebuchadnezzar roamed back and forth among these wild asses. Fourth thing we saw was he was fed with grass like oxen. And fifth, his body was wet with the dew of heaven. Why? Because he was living outside. But God, who raised him up and brought him down, brought him back up again. And at the end of verse 21, he was restored to sanity. And when he recognized who is the Most High God, and that he, the Most High God, ruleth in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomsoever he will. So the ultimate power does not lie with Nebuchadnezzar, but with the God of Israel. And it is this God who sets over the kingdoms of men whomsoever he wills. That was the lesson of history. The question is, did Belshazzar know what had happened to his grandfather, or did he not know? In the next 2 verses, we see the real nature of Belshazzar's sin, as Daniel now begins that lesson in verses 22 to 24. Now, I missed this part, didn't I? Okay. Anyway, that's your lot for today. Study hard, grow strong. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time.